by way of background, I'm with AMDOCS networking software division, and I have a background as actually from being an operator for many years with O2, which ultimately became acquired by Telefonica. I was then CEO with OpenNet. We developed software in the policy charging, data management, data mediation space. And then about a year and a half ago, we were acquired by AMDOCS. So I'm now a general manager in the AMDOCS technology networking division, specifically looking at the network side of things. So it's a great privilege to be invited to kind of present this morning. A number of the topics that Christoph had mentioned, are enormously kind of topical in discussions in the vendor community, and with a lot of customer engagements we have with CTOs and CIOs and so on. Things like security and disaggregation and insourcing and centers of excellence, and they all really, they're very, very strongly apply in the kind of network automation orchestration space as part of a broader kind of industry initiative. And this, disruptive change is happening now. It's probably not huge news for people, but it's worth reflecting. I find, one of the big, immediate transformations that I'd seen when, particularly back in OpenNet times was that many people I think will recall is the transformation in the handset market. And this Forbes kind of copy of Forbes magazine, which dates from 2007, I beg your pardon. At that stage, Nokia had, 1 billion handsets in the world, and nobody saw that, within a couple of years, the situation would be completely reversed. And I think in the evolution of networks and the vendor community, as well as the telcos themselves, that there's a massive kind of Schumpeter level change about creative destruction going on. And it's a quiet revolution, but it's very, very significant. Driven by cloud, driven by AI, driven by advances in 5G technology, and as Christoph referred to earlier on, things like connectivity being, at the center of everything, with 5G providing the kind of bandwidth, the cloud providing the edge capabilities, and industry being able to, with devices, incorporate a huge amount of new productivity into how they do things. So I think that we're at that kind of Nokia point now, the Nokia handset point now in the industry on how we see how networks will evolve. And that's not to in any way, talk down the challenge that the management of legacy networks will have. But I think telcos themselves turning into tech companies is absolutely an inevitable capability for those that will succeed and thrive. And yes, they will absolutely have to look at legacy management and so on, and that will in turn change the value propositions for some of the existing vendors. It'll change the employment characteristics of some of the employment kind of drivers for some of the telcos themselves. So Christoph talked about insourcing for key skills, and I think that's absolutely, first of all, the right thing to do, and second of all, an inevitable kind of move in the market as the telco value proposition changes, which, as I say, vendors then need to accommodate that, because rather than delivering end-to-end solutions and the telco really doesn't care what's happening, I think a more engaged, collaborative kind of approach, which will involve partial disaggregation, not only at the RAN level, but at other levels as well. So the industry is changing, and the vendor landscape is changing very, very rapidly behind the scenes. And I think anybody who thinks that the world in 2022 is different from, is the same as the world in 2021 is crazy, because the era of partnerships between telcos and the vendor community is now, and that involves doing things differently on both sides. And because the technology is changing very rapidly, and at the same time, the commercial opportunities. This is survival, not only about growth, but I think the business case and what the business case involves is changing too. And this really, this is a kind of a very basic kind of, my background is finance, and this is what a sexy side for finance guys looks like. But a telco today being about static connectivity, you have a large division between the fixed network or fiber and the wireless part of the business. Data is largely internal, compute is largely done in appliances. Some of them are moving to the cloud, some of them aren't. You know, a lot of that is actually now changing in kind of the, at least in the 5G network investments, and to an extent, the 4G, 5G networks are in the same bag. Some of the pre-4G technology will continue to exist, as well as some of the applications running those kind of things will exist as well, because a lot of the growth moving forward will be very innovative services off the core network, and a lot of engagement out at the enterprise level, out at the edge. And this is where the cloud and 5G and applications technology becomes really, really important. And the innovation, I have yet to meet a single telco who talks about innovating on behalf of the enterprise markets. What a lot of them are talking about, and I think this is where Christoph referred to insourcing, a lot of that technology innovation will be where the telcos can help the enterprises innovate using the telco assets, which means you need to expose those assets in clever ways, and they've got to be done safely and securely and so on. And when you expose those assets, they then got to work. And this, in a roundabout way, comes back to where automation and exposure and orchestration becomes really, really important. Because in the end of the day, there'll be so many different services going on simultaneously, particularly in the kind of 4G, 5G kind of layer and through to the fiber layer inside networks, that you need to use AI capabilities, and you need to use clever algorithms to help you do common tasks over and over and over again, and to do it safely, because otherwise you'd have a workforce that would run to hundreds of thousands, even in smaller operators. So a lot of what we think of when we think about orchestration, and as we're developing products and solutions in this area, is, we've got to focus on the intent, defining the required outcomes for systems, and then when those systems in productions, let the systems work it out, rather than it becoming an artisan school of a small number of people who know how the network works. It's got to be a much more generic set of rules that can actually make the network do more or less end to end as much as possible, common tasks, and kind of figure it out using algorithms based on available capacity in the network, and various other kind of trigger events. And obviously, why do it? Reducing the cost to run and use the network. If you can remove the need to understand all of those trigger points, you remove a lot of risk, complexity. You can simplify an awful lot of things. Simplifying the building and running of the network, it's kind of a little bit self-evident, and it's a little bit painful because there's significant legacy investments in here. So what you're really talking about putting some of this new tech in is for new services that are coming. And we're at that unique time now in the next 12 and 24 months where not so much you throw out the old stuff at all, but certainly new services that are being created can be created in a different kind of architecture and environment. And as I say, a lot of the managing the network with business objectives and not the devices with specific commands, it sounds like a very simple thing, but it's actually quite a subtle and deep or profound kind of statement, because you need to understand what the business objectives are to make that sentence real. And those business objectives are changing because the customer landscape is changing. So there's quite a lot of work to be done in this area to make sure that what's being built is actually what the market will need rather than what the market has needed historically. And very simple kind of illustration of what I'm talking about is when you're automating, you've got a network designer in a classic kind of model, and service activation and service orchestration and so on. It's all application level stuff. It requires a small number of geniuses to actually define generic kind of capabilities, and an ongoing large operations teams to make sure it all stays inside the tram lines. And it requires, as you can imagine, a new service to be created requires an awful lot of moving parts to be coordinated, human level moving parts. Whereas the kind of North Star, as we would see it, is that you have an orchestration capability that's capable of transcending the network, that you have a network that can respond to these kind of commands, and then an intelligent assurance and optimization capability which feeds back in a loop. So you're really looking to automate based on these intents of what you're at, based on the available cloud capacity, the available RAN capabilities, the capacity of those RAN capabilities, and so on and so forth. So you can do an awful lot in this space it's probably not worthwhile looking back to try and transform a lot of the legacy capabilities that's there. It's probably not practical either. But for some of the new services and some of the new markets that are opening up to telcos, this is incredibly important to get it right now. And diving into that, and forgive my vivid use of hot pink, but intense systems, the approach is, without beating this one to death, you're largely using what we call solvers to actually work out different outcomes and then choose which is the best outcome based on the business objective. And you then drill into, when the decision is made, do it, measure it to make sure that everything is the way you expected it to be, diagnose it if it's not, report it if it's not, get the network to be alive to either communicate directly to the end customers or to an assurance team or to a fraud team and so on, because there is security aspects to this which can be built in as well. And you have different levels of automation which are, based on semi-intelligent, not full AI by any means, but certainly semi-intelligent things around. You want closed loop kind of analytics for service. You want closed loop analytics at the network level, and so on and so forth. And a lot of these have to be like about 25% have to be real time kind of analytics, almost in the call path, if you will, or near in that real time. And then others which can be done more post event at a more kind of leisurely pace. So the requirement for automation capabilities and the insights and trigger events, the interpretation of what all of that means and the business impact of what it means, because it obviously can impact on SLAs for commercially, it can impact on SLAs for other reasons as well, service degradation, and what do you do about it, fraud and cost management, and so on and so forth. So there's quite a lot of, again, thinking and understanding and collaboration that's required between the vendors, because I do think as new services are created, inevitably a lot of the large telco groups or collaborations of independent telco groups will need to come together, or will come together, in fact, to design their own services. They will not want to be necessarily hostage to the vendor community doing it all out of the box. If you project forward 5 years from now, the industry may be so stable that that the pendulum swings the other way, and that the telcos will look for large players who can come in and do the end-to-end for them. But I think in the, between now and that 5 years from now kind of scenario, a lot of the telcos will want to have the expertise and the capability back in-house, not only to run their own network, but to engage with their enterprise customers or device manufacturers that are looking to have experiences on the network tailored to their devices. And the telcos will want to own that conversation, quite rightly, I think. And they will work with cloud guys, and they'll work with software vendors like ourselves, and they'll work with potentially, SIs who are very specific to industry verticals, because obviously the enterprises themselves will have the technology capability and the experience that they want to enable on the connectivity networks. They'll also then have the ERP systems and all of the other enabling systems at the other end needed to digest it. So it's a really interesting realignment of the vendor marketplace. But intent-driven end-to-end service orchestration, the analogy is, the guy who's ordering a taxi for 6 executives from the, from the office to the restaurant, and Uber largely does a job of doing the intent-driven part of that. In a network, you're seeing kind of end-to-end service orchestration and provisioning, which ultimately, moving to the provisioning and then onto the assurance, you're talking about in these simple slides, capabilities of the network making decisions based on these input criteria, least cost routing or best quality bandwidth or best experience for whatever reason. But getting the network to make up its own mind and actually do the routing. And there are tools like the NWDAF and the NEF kind of that the standards define will make this more and more of reality. And then beyond that, you will have an AI level inside every network, at the network level, the IT level, and so on, that will manage the both inner workings and resource allocations inside that network. And dynamically make decisions and so on, which based on the intent and the actual experience service levels. This slide, I dislike it enormously because It talks about slice orchestration, because obviously in a 5G network, you not only have a single core network, you've obviously got different service slices that can be enabled. But the intention or the recognition here is, there'll be a finite number of, there'll be RAN slicing, but there'll also be kind of core slicing as well. Some of those for security reasons and operating cost reasons and so on will be, it'll be important to embrace in this vision the fact that you're going to slice up a network to do different things at different levels of quality and experience, depending on the end customer base. At the risk of not wanting to bore people to death, if you will, I'll stop there, if you will, Annie, and just ask if anybody has any questions.
Well, thank you, Niall. That was quite a blast. A lot of information and a lot of ideas there. I would like to ask you, when you were talking towards the end about the intent-based networks, what sort of time frame are we talking about? 6 months, 5 years?
I think a lot of the bigger networks are actually looking at this and working out. They're at the end of the strategy piece, and they're now in the assessment of the various vendors and the relationship they have with vendors. So I think, it's 0 days through to the next 12 months will be really, really formative periods of time. I think this is like pulling a thread out of a jumper. As soon as you pull one thread, lots of other threads appear. So if you take something simple, like I'd like to make my network simpler to use because I want to engage with enterprise customers, that's cool. But then you get into, well, the value proposition. Am I the guy who'll engage with the customers, or do I want my workforce to do that? And if I want my workforce to do it, I then need to look at the culture and the training, and I then need to look at the vendor relationship more holistically and so on. So I think what started off as an engineering exercise around 5G has been changed quite utterly by cloud and edge and the new markets that those things can enable, which in turn gave rise to, well, gosh, if I'm going to do all that, I need AI capability to make the network run faster. So the thread became a bigger thread as people pulled on it more and more. But I think that thinking and a lot of the themes that Christoph had actually referred to is kind of what I'm talking about. A lot of the very good groups are now much more aware that this becomes a very fundamental strategic issue for the next 5 years, starting with the commercial model and then working out what all of that means, because it isn't a winning strategy to just dive in and adopt 5G and assume that they'll work out everything else afterwards. It becomes a very expensive, hard to retrofit model if you do that. So a lot of the first movers on 5G are now looking at, what have they done? They've got the radio piece sorted. They now want to embrace disaggregating capabilities around O-RAN. And to Christoph's point, we see O-RAN beginning to pick up a pace, but it's still very immature in terms of adoption, but it will become matured. It's like Linux. When Linux came along and no one wanted to touch it, within 2 years, every telco I talked to back in 2006 did not want anything to do with Linux. It was just unreliable, blah, blah, blah. And by 2008, you couldn't sell a system that wasn't working on Linux. And the cloud is in that moment right now. Do you want Kubernetes or whatever flavor of cloud you want, or multiple clouds? I think O-RAN is in exactly the same place right now. Everybody sees the strategic value of it, and therefore it's an unstoppable force.
It's got some serious weight behind it from some operators too. So Dean asks, given that mobile coverage, especially for 5G and URLLC stroke slicing, will never be ubiquitous, how can intent-based systems deal with the physical limits? Do you need to build mechanisms in to say, sorry, we can't do that, and deal with the experience and the commercial implications? Or what do you do?
Yeah, the thing is, I think a lot of the, I think it's a fair comment. First of all, I think the reality is that 4G isn't ubiquitous, or wasn't ubiquitous for a very long time. So in some areas, you got to recognize you're not going to get HD stream video. Now there's different ways of solving those problems, but where do you need, in some respects, you only offer, sorry, a bit of background noise there. There is, I don't think that anybody's actually thinks
okay,
that.
We need to be quiet now. I can't hear.
Yogesh,
Let me
please could
see.
you turn your microphone off? Thank you.
My phone out. My
Carry on.
thing out. Should I get my thing?
I think possibly. Sorry, I think it's a fair comment, but I'm not a big believer there'll ever be ubiquitous 5G. But I think what you will see is where fiber and, you know, and again, Christoph, without poor Christoph, I keep referring to what he said, but he touched on a couple of themes. The operator's role, the central value proposition, isn't about creating content. It isn't about all the device manufacture. It's about connectivity and the science of connectivity. And the reality is that a combination of fiber, wireless, low Earth orbit, satellites and things like, they solve those problems. So there will be innovative solutions to create, because in the end, the operator as Techcos will be solving problems. And that's, you know, there's a market there, they will fill it. Nature abhors that vacuum, you know.
Okay, and David asks, with the current semiconductor supply situation and long lead times on fundamental hardware platforms like network computing storage for telco, and even of new products and technologies, all these things are going to be pivotal to the new telco operations. How does AMDOCS foresee these factors impacting the shift of telco to Techco?
Yeah, look, I think it's, you know, there's first of all, we had COVID, and then we had global supply chain disruption potentials out of geopolitical issues. And there's no doubt that it's certainly got short-term supply issues. But I think you'd measure the disruption capability here in months rather than years, because COVID almost gave us a jump start on supply chains are vulnerable, and people have already started making decisions around nearshoring some of these capabilities. I think the geopolitical thing will further enhance the investment around, you know, in North America or in Europe, or, you know, different trading blocks will want to have strategic industries inside their own sphere of influence, even if they're not the most cost effective in a pure globalized world. So the geopolitics piece, I think, will ultimately take care of that. And our view would be, you know, the world has already begun to react a little bit to the semiconductor shortages and things like that. They're big capex investment programs, there's no doubt about it. But that, you know, within 12 months, I think a lot of those issues will no longer be as critical as they're seen today.
Okay, and we have another question from Dean. If telcos shift to a platform model, how does that bring them deeper into the new European Union Digital Markets Act and that regulatory framework? And what are the implications? Are the operators gatekeepers in that scenario?
Yeah, it's funny. We did lots of research over the last number of years in this area, because what always fascinated me was telcos for 20 years or more have possessed the most incredible insights on their customers and have never, ever abused it, at least not to my knowledge, in any kind of significant fashion. So I think telcos have got this enormous people's champion, business championship role, should they exercise it. And that's why I'd be so upbeat about telcos having a very strong kind of capability versus the very large internet players who are the other end of the spectrum from the trust quotient. Telcos are trusted, and that's a relationship that they've spent years and years and years building. The European regulators, the US regulators, and so on. But let's say with Europe, because that's where the question started. I think that they are, based on our experience, they're enormously comfortable with the telco role here. I think will they stay gatekeepers? Only to the extent that I think they have an opportunity to inherit more of the value chain and be trusted to have that value chain inside their value propositions. I think the application level, I don't think the telcos will be or can be or should be the gatekeepers for the applications that they're enabling, any more than I think, you know, Apple should be entirely the gatekeeper for the apps on their app stores. You know, I think making sure that they're not filled with unwelcome viruses and making sure that if they have people who reported that they stop dealing with them. But I think, you know, taking on the regulatory burden for all of the applications that are provided when, you know, isn't realistic. but more importantly, the guarding of the experience and the profiling and all of the other kind of bits, that's an enormous white space for or blue water or blue ocean, whatever you like to call it, for the telco operators, which I'd be very upbeat about them being welcomed by businesses, because, not being funny, but I guess our experience is that there are a number of enterprises who would be a bit wary of dealing with some of the very large hyperscalers, in case the hyperscalers get insights into how their businesses work, and then suddenly they find the hyperscaler is in that business. They don't have the same issues, I think, at all with their relationship with telcos. And that's based on, as I say, at least 20 years of really good insight capability that's never been abused.
Yes, I was talking to a large European operator recently who said it's not just the data either, but quite a few people are worried about having all their business processes visible, because business models can be,
absolutely,
should we say, borrowed, so emulated, whatever. So we have a question here from Robert, and he says, what is the one, in your opinion, what is the one most important action a telco CEO should be taking today to move the vision, the Techco vision, forward?
For me, it's culture. I actually think it's down to all the bits and bytes that come with a cloud, or the engineering of a network, or suddenly I've got virtual RAN, or I've got ORAN and things like that. The vast majority of businesses are actually wrestling with are they being transparent with all of their people about what happens next? And do they have relevance in the new marketplaces of the world? Can they stop the brain drain from their businesses into the hyperscalers and other places, right? They've got the articulation of a very positive vision about where the Techcos will be. The telcos becoming Techcos shouldn't be scary. It should be really, really exciting. If you can imagine, the analogy of, telco when it was just doing voice was kind of like in the early days of the West being populated in the US, running telegraph poles. And now we're bringing television, and we're bringing video conferencing. It's that order of magnitude of innovation across all kinds of lines of business, and the societal benefit that it can come with it by driving, environmental agendas and, startup innovation and all that stuff. Insourcing and becoming excellent at providing services to a whole new source of customers is incredibly reassuring for a workforce. They also want to feel proud of where they work, but to feel proud, you need to articulate, well, why is this a place to be proud of? And there's so much there that's coming out of these strategy reviews that once articulated, you'll find the workforce becomes highly motivated, highly proud of being part of that kind of revolution. And that's, for me, that's the one thing that isn't necessarily yet well done. I think it's not because people don't want to. I think it's just because what 5G, when people say 5G, some people think immediately of the radio technology. In our business, we think about 5G, but it's a catch-all for cloud and AI and new business models and a whole compendium of these kind of capabilities, all of which ultimately comes back to what Christoph said. It's about connectivity and what you do with it. And if you can make that exciting, make that sexy for your people, for your partners, if you can engage with your vendors in the right kind of way, it becomes terribly exciting.
Niall, thank you very much. That was interesting. And actually, I was going to ask you a question about insourcing, but then you brought it up yourself. And I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you so much for your time and insights. That was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I hope you have the rest of the conference goes very well. Thanks, Annie.
Thank you.